or to resume. So we briefly talked about, so some of those strategies included, for example, the CIA helping to bring about coups. So these are some of the places where it did, including South Vietnam, which was actually allied to the US. So it's kind of a little unusual that you are trying to have a coup in a country that is your friend. We shall probably talk about that briefly next week. We talked about the Cold War politics, so for example, uranium, finding peace. We talked about the formation of the United Nations, so an organization that was supposed to ensure global peace. I'm not sure that it has done that. This was the first UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. I believe he was Swedish. And so some of the things that you see with the Cold War, for example, it was suspected that his plane was shot down with the complicity of the US, Belgium, France, Israel. And so you see the jockeying of these interests across different spheres. Sometimes the Cold War became hot, or at least the major powers supported one side or the other. And so one of the best examples, actually two examples, include Vietnam and Korea. So if you think about the conditions of the Cold War and what countries did. So for example, the US helped South Korea, which did not want to become a communist state. And so it helped them fight off the what would have been the northern aggression support by China. That was another period when the world almost came to a nuclear blowout. Because you have the US with its nuclear weapons, and well, China didn't have nuclear weapons, but also North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union and China. And so if you sort of think about the Cold War, its effects go on today. The US still has troops in South Korea. And so some of these things were not necessarily resolved. And so this is kind of some of what goes on. So, for example, the Soviet Union attained the nuclear bomb in 1949, and so now it was on equal footing with the US. So, but the thing was, just because you have nuclear weapons, can you use them? I mentioned that did I mention? So, because the UN was formed in 1945 to try and resolve conflicts and grievances, the 5 permanent members, I probably mentioned that if any of the permanent members votes no on a resolution, that resolution dies. For example, I think this was maybe last week, probably Wednesday or Thursday, and there was a resolution in front of the UN Security Council to try and give Palestine nationhood. And so technically the Security Council, UN Security Council has 15 members. 5 of them are permanent. The other 10 rotate geographically. So for example, Africa has 2, Europe probably has 2, Asia probably has 2. So the 15 members, but what matters is the 5 permanent members. And so in that vote for Palestinian statehood, the US voted no, which was a veto. Britain, which also has a veto, abstained. France, which also has a veto, actually supported Palestinian statehood. So you can sort of see how the Security Council can be challenging. But so in 1950, the UN Security Council was presented with the question of how to resolve the conflict in Korea. And so the US actually, the Security Council was voting, the Soviet Union left their vote, and so leaving is not vetoing. And so the UN actually sent troops into Korea for the first time in history. Now, so this is maybe a good timeline of some of the most important things that we see from 1945. So, for example, India and Pakistan become independent. People's Republic of China is formed. This is the big China. But also, so there was a Chinese Civil War in 1947 to 1949. The communists won, again with the help of the USSR and China. The US was backing the Nationalists, and so the Nationalists were defeated and they moved to Taiwan. Today, Taiwan is an ally of the United States. In fact, it gets lots of weapons. But there are often, so the view of the People's Republic of China is that Taiwan is part of China. The view of Taiwan is that they want independence, and so there's that disagreement over what to do. But so China, for example, gave the US and USSR maybe a view of what the Cold War was going to be, supporting different sides. Egypt becomes independent in 1952. Actually, Gamal Abdel Nasser his people killed the king. His name was Farouk. So again, important events. We shall probably not talk about some of these, like the Morocco-Tunisia independence or the Suez War. We shall definitely talk about the Sputnik, and Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkov. But anyway, so these are some of the major things you could look to when we think about the Cold War. Now, remember the Cold War was about, it was an ideological disagreement between East and West. Now, in this country, the idea of communism is really frowned upon. Actually, it's absolutely not welcome. In the 1950s, if you are accused of being a communist, that was not a really good thing. And so we see the McCarthyism. So Senator Joseph McCarthy started talking about how everyone was a communist. Actually said Eisenhower was, maybe it was Truman, was a communist or something, or he was friends with communists, which is. But Margaret Chase Smith made a speech. So, like, there was this witch hunt, and if you express any sort of positive view of anything in the Soviet Union or other communist nations, you are thought to be communist, even if you are not. And so, there was accusations everywhere that people are communists and they're helping Russia. Now, some people are communists and helping the Soviet Union. So, for example, there were a number of spies that were caught, people who are spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. But actually, if you think about the statecraft in that context, this former US ambassador who apparently was spying for Cuba for about, many years. And so there was this question of McCarthyism and whether people are communists and, those kinds of things. And so it was a scary time because you could be accused even if you are not necessarily communist. Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb, was actually accused of being a communist. He had socialist leanings, but everybody was accused. Now, so thinking about global conditions, it's useful to look at whether just because there was communism, the question was, are you just going to take communism and that is going to be it and that's how you're going to be ruled? And so, for example, in the German Democratic Republic, as they call themselves, there were revolts. So communist governments are often very oppressive. They do not allow for freedom of expression and those other things. And so this is what we see in, I think we mentioned Berlin, which is kind of here. Yeah. And so people from East Germany would come into West Berlin and then they would defect to the West. And so about 1 million people defected between 1949 and 53 before the border was sealed off. And so you actually see uprisings. So, for example, in very many cities, but the Soviet reaction was, okay, we can't have people revolting. We might know something about this because, last weekend, college campuses, Palestine. So protests were not allowed or a criticism or any of those things. And so Berlin became one of the exit points until a wall was built. Now, so Stalin, as I mentioned before, was the Soviet premier so Soviet leaders were generally referred to as the chairman of the Communist Party. So they didn't and the idea was that it was more egalitarian. So Stalin rules the Soviet Union from about 1925 to about 1953 when he dies. And so there's then a bit of time to figure out who is going to become the next leader. So the next leader became Nikita Khrushchev. So people just call him Khrushchev. And so his official title was the Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. And so he became the Soviet leader. And so he kind of had a different maybe plan than Stalin had. So for example, he made investments in agriculture, consumer goods. And so he also criticizes Stalin in a speech. Now again, remember, no one from the West kind of knew what was going on inside the Soviet Union, particularly with this change of leadership. The Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad, actually got a copy of the speech and sent it to the West. And so when the West saw this speech, they were like, Khrushchev said Stalin was not a good person. And so there was a bit of a split. Khrushchev eventually becomes a horrible human being because, Cuban Missile Crisis. But so but he actually came to the US like in 1957 and so on. If you look up the kitchen debate, you will see, what am I thinking of? The kitchen debate. You will see Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier, and Nixon, who was the vice president, having this debate about the merits of communism versus capitalism. But so again, he takes over, he has a slightly different approach. But the slightly different approach did not really vary very much because, for example, when Poland wanted independence, so again, if you think about the Second World War, there was a bit of I lost that thought. But if you think about countries that were under the Soviet rule but wanted independence, for example, Hungary, Poland, and so on, we see the Soviet Union coming in and crushing any of those dissents. So we see those revolts in places like Hungary, and so for example, Hungary. Imre Nagy, this picture is of him. He wanted to decide whether Hungary could become democratic. Now, if you look at a map of Europe, and where Hungary is, it's sort of like in the middle of the Soviet spheres of influence. And so the Soviet Union was not very happy. And so we see even in Poland revolts. So, for example, 1968, 1956, 68, 1980. And so we begin to see. So if anyone says that communism produced stability, this is not true. Because, you are coercing people to believe what you want them to believe. But so we probably should talk about space. There's an allegation that Americans landed on the moon in 1969. They probably did. But also, I'm sure you watched Hidden Figures, maybe? And no? Oh, you should watch Hidden Figures. It's there's a bunch of racism. There's a bunch of there's great representation of African Americans. But so this is 1950s. The Soviet Union and the US both have nuclear weapons. But the question now was, can you maybe park some of them in space? If you watch Bond movies, James Bond, I think there's one that has something about GoldenEye, which is, park nuclear missiles in space. But anyway, so basically from 1945, the US and USSR were trying to gain an advantage, whether it's in space, whether it's territorially. And so the first vehicles to go into space were German V2 rockets. Now, that was newer technology. It was like, we can send stuff to space. And so the head of the German V2 project came to the US. And, the US was like, oh, he wasn't a Nazi. He was, just doing his job. And so what eventually happens is he comes to the US and is trying to help the US to develop ballistic missile capability. So if you ever watch a space launch, especially with Elon Musk, those rockets sort of, like, that is the basic foundation of rocketry. So space vehicles are really just missiles with people on top. Now, the US was trying, but the US rockets kept crashing. And so the US was very surprised when the Soviet Union put a satellite in space and, did other things. So, for example, the first satellite in space was Sputnik. Yuri Gagarin, pictured here, was the first man in space. And so the US is like, what happened to us? And so Sputnik is launched. Cosmonauts, so Russian astronauts are called cosmonauts. And so we see, for example, Yuri Gagarin going to space, Valentina Tereshkova. And so the US is like, how did the Soviets overtake us in technology? Now they are sending people and things to space. So this is the first object to orbit in space, and this is this is a rendering of Sputnik. And so again, if you look at these rockets, this is the view of the rockets. And so the upper stage is what put the Sputnik in space. And so it was launched in October 1957. This might play or it might not. So that's a replica of Sputnik being prepared. And so if you compare with the person who is, I don't know, is polishing it or doing something. So it wasn't very big. But the fact that the US was lagging behind in what was called the missile gap. So this is one of the rockets that launched Sputnik. And so you can see it's a huge thing. But the basis of this were ballistic missiles. So the US developed many, the Soviet Union developed quite a bunch of these vehicles. And so most of the, and so you can probably see here the
Today, a new moon is in the sky,
released.
a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a
somewhere
Russian
there,
rocket.
or
Here
became
an artist's
art.
conception of how the feat was accomplished. Three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point 500 miles up. The artificial moon was boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
So that, the US is concerned that it did not, it was lagging behind the Soviet Union. So space race, that's where it comes from. Ballistic missiles, people on top, send them to the moon, maybe now send them to Mars. This is Valentina Tereshkova. Now, so we're talking about the 1960s. 1963 is when she actually went to space. She's still alive. So this is not like history that is, that's 200 years ago. She now is a deputy in Russia's Duma, the parliament. These days, Russia has fallen out of favor with many people. But so the Cold War continues with many different things. So, for example, the Cuban Revolution of 1959. I probably mentioned that Batista was overthrown by Castro, and so this was a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro and his brother Raul Castro. Again, they did the revolution in revolution in 1959. I think the last Castro, maybe Fidel, died in the 2010s. So again, it's not like history that is. Today, the US still doesn't see eye to eye with Cuba. And this goes back to the Cold War. And so again, history sometimes can have continuing effects, even when we don't think about them. Now, so what was the reaction of the U.S. to the Cuban Revolution? The U.S. was like, okay, we cannot have communists 90 miles off the U.S. coast. And so we are going to try and overthrow Castro and maybe assassinate him. It is reported that there were about 100 attempts to assassinate Castro. Of course, the US might have had a hand in that, but we are not even going to. So anyway, the idea was topple Castro and maybe bring back Batista or a democratic regime. To do this, the US did not want to, invade Cuba. So they found Cuban rebels who had been disaffected or affected by the confiscation of property and so on. And so he was trying to get them to start the revolution. And so Bay of Pigs happened. Now, Bay of Pigs happens under Kennedy's presidency because, Kennedy takes over in 1961. But the plan was already there. And so he was like, we are not going to give it up. But it was a debacle. It was a catastrophe. It was a terrible outcome. The Cubans knew about it. And so Castro actually was pictured a lot on a battle tank going to the beach where these rebels landed to maybe fight them, maybe. Now, other places the Cold War manifests include, for example, the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 because of the people who are fleeing from East Germany into West Berlin and then going to the West. So, but people also were like jumping fences and so on. And so a wall was built. The wall was, I think, 107 kilometers, 4 meters in height. This great debate about walls and whether they work. The United States, there's a former president who says that you should build walls. But there was another wise man who said if you build a 40-foot fence, people just need to buy a 41-foot ladder. So fences and walls sometimes just don't help. But so this Berlin Wall was patrolled, and if you were caught going over the wall, yeah, you could be shot. So this is a map of Berlin, both of them. So East Berlin and West Berlin, because remember, even Berlin was divided between the victorious powers. So up here is the wall. I think you can probably jump over, but so there were watchtowers and so on. On the right is actually a chunk of the wall when it came down in 1989. People actually have souvenirs of that, like, oh, communist is over, communism is over. So that was a good. Now, one of the maybe worst periods in human history was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Um, and so I know this is from X-Men, but if you yeah, so there was a lot of questions about nuclear weapons and war and so on. But so after the Bay of Pigs, after the U.S. tried to invade Cuba, Cuba decided to invite the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union comes to Cuba and starts building missile, launch pads. So the U.S. is like, wait, they are doing what? So having nuclear missiles in the Western Hemisphere, especially so close to the US, was not something anyone was very fond of. And so this is the genesis of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, Castro is worried the US will overthrow him, so he invites the communist overlord, and the overlord Khrushchev decides to place missiles in Cuba. Now, there's a whole story behind why the Soviet Union decided that it could place nuclear missiles in Cuba. It had something to do with Kennedy meeting Khrushchev in Berlin, maybe, in 1961. And so Khrushchev's perception of Kennedy was he is weak. So if we send missiles over there to Cuba, so we can stare him down. That did go very well. And so the U.S. suspected, of course, they were collecting intelligence, and they were seeing all these Russian ships going to Cuba, and they're like, what is going on? So one of the elements of the Cold War, as we've mentioned, is spying. Everybody was spying on everybody else. Well, maybe mostly the U.S. spying on most other people. And so one of the tools that the US had at that point to do spying was U-2 planes. U-2 planes could fly at about 70,000 feet, which is like basically they were almost out of range of anti-aircraft missiles. And so they were used extensively, including filming Soviet troops. But that didn't go very well because actually Gary Powers was shot down in a U-2 plane. But so the U-2 planes actually see, they photograph some of, I don't know if you have some photographs from the incident. But so this this map shows you how far the missiles could go. So the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so the Kennedy administration is like, you know what, Cubans, you probably need to reverse your decision, and the Soviet Union needs to take out these missiles. So the U.S. blockades Cuba. Now this is, so this up here is the U-2. If you ever go up to Sterling, Virginia, you might probably see a replica of one. It was succeeded by the Blackbird, this SR-71, which is said to be the fastest plane on the planet. So yeah, so this is a view of the black battles here. But so this is the one that was taking pictures then, and it's the kind of plane that Gary Powers was flying when he was shot down. So today, people don't. Oh, the Chinese still fly balloons over the U.S., but people kind of generally use satellites to spy on other people. If you sort of think about Google Maps, that is it Google Maps or Google Earth? But anyway, so this is some of the reporting on the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is where Cuba is, and so the U.S. blockades the whole of Cuba, and it's like if you are trying to go into Cuba, we are going to investigate you. We are going to board your ship, and there was the world almost came to an end during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yeah, these are some of the pictures that were taken by the U-2. Yeah, and so you can see the missile trailers, equipment, tanks, launch pads, and so on. And so the U.S. wasn't having any of this. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was tense about 12, 13 days. But eventually the Soviet Union decided to withdraw its missiles from Cuba on condition that the U.S. withdrew some of its missiles. I think it's maybe the Titan from Europe. Now the U.S. was going to withdraw the missiles anyway because they were outdated, and so it was a good maybe outcome. So in other places, life in Eastern Europe was terrible. Police states were very prevalent. So if you think about, for example, KGB and its successor, the FSB, spying on people, killing people, and people being sent to concentration camps and labor camps and penal colonies. If you follow some of this news, you'd probably know that there was an election in Russia maybe this month, of course, Putin won overwhelmingly. But it also happens that his rival, his most fierce rival, was in jail. Actually, he was killed before the election. So don't really mess with Russians. But anyway, so police command economics, so it doesn't tell you what we produce. It's a very funny story told about command economics and Napoleon's complex. Napoleon complex. Napoleon complex was what we Storm killed many people, and in this case, there's lots of people in China, so you know. Now, news was recorded in a medical red book. Everyone was doing the little red book. This is actually the quotations. So where he thought it became Arab peoples. And so the question was how that realization will be a homeland. And so this was what was called the partition plan. Yeah. So this is gives you sort of there was a lot of conflict even after the independence because the Palestinians are like, there's no homeland here. So we kind of need to keep them out. And so the theory was that if you divided and give Palestinians the territory, you know, now so this again was a partition plan, original partition plan. The challenging thing about this partition plan is that Jerusalem was going to be a neutral city. The reason for this is because Jerusalem has very important, it has a significance for the three major monotheistic faiths. So think about Christianity, Jesus, Israel, Jerusalem. Muslims, there is a mosque that is the third holiest site in the whole of Islam. It's in Jerusalem. For Jewish people, Jerusalem is the Wailing Wall. So the Wailing Wall is the remnant of basically the remnant of Solomon's temple. And so this is really important to Jewish people. So if you sort of think about how the situation went from this to this, so this became a petition. Then people began to grab land from the Jewish people for the future Jewish state. And so today, this is what the state architect would look like. And so even when we had these discussions, including that for last week, people always go back to the 1977 partition plan. So this is what architect would look like. I still don't know how you have country in two places. Maybe just kind of put it there. Now, of course, there's mention that 1947 was a good year for Israel because that both states would head to conflict with Palestinians and Israelis.
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark. Just to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized. There was heated debate in the assembly. This is the delegate from Saudi Arabia arguing against partition.